Dr. Mitch Zeller was the director of the FDA Center for Tobacco Products from March 2013 through April 2022. However, he has been working with FDA since 1980s. And as a center director, Dr. Zeller led FDA efforts to use the tool of product regulation to reduce diseases and death from tobacco products. During his work at the FDA, he has been instrumental in crafting the agency's tobacco regulations, and also he has been representing FDA before Congress, federal, and state agencies. Currently, Dr. Zeller serves as an advisor to Qnovia, a startup pharmaceutical company developing an inhaled smoking cessation product that it's intended to seek FDA authorization. Please start when you're ready, Dr. Zeller.
Great, thanks. Again, my disclosure is I recently joined the small startup Qnovia as an advisor. And as you heard, they are seeking FDA authorization for a novel inhaled smoking cessation product. That's my only disclosure. What I'd like to do in this talk is sort of take a step back and before diving into that statutory and regulatory framework, let's go back and review what the tobacco industry knew about nicotine, when they knew it, what they knew about the relationship between nicotine and cigarette design as far back as the late 1950s, because I think that's an important framing before we get into the science and before we get into today's regulatory and statutory framework. But then I will walk you through the key provisions of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. And you heard Brian comment on this a bit. I think it's also important for researchers and modelers to understand the process that FDA has to go through to enact a policy like this. So I'll walk you through what is known as notice and comment rulemaking, explain the concepts of final agency action, which then opens the door for any potential litigation down the road. But let's start with what did they know and when did they know it? The old Watergate questions about the tobacco industry, meaning the cigarette industry back then, and nicotine. And for those of you who have seen me give talks over the years, you've seen me use this quote almost every time. This is from the top lawyer of Brown and Williamson, a company that no longer exists, but at the time, 1963, they were the third largest cigarette company in the United States. This quote, "Nicotine is addictive. We are then in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug." Again, from their top lawyer, not from a researcher or scientist. And 1963 is important because not only was that a year before the first ever Surgeon General's report, it was a quarter century before the Surgeon General was finally able to conclude that the nicotine in cigarettes was addictive. That didn't happen until 1988. The industry knew it at least a quarter of a century, if not more, earlier in their private and secret communications. R.J. Reynolds in 1972 said the tobacco industry may be thought of as being a specialized, highly ritualized, and stylized segment of the pharmaceutical industry. Tobacco products uniquely contain and deliver nicotine, a potent drug with a variety of physiological effects. Reynolds also had some really interesting insights, first to what they described as the so-called confirmed smoker, whose choice of product and pattern of usage primarily determined by individual nicotine dosage requirements. And Reynolds said its industry, the cigarette industry, is based upon the design, manufacture, and sale of attractive dosage forms of nicotine. Reynolds then talks about this thing called a pre-smoker or non-smoker. And as I walk you through this quote, you'll see the euphemisms. The euphemisms are important for what they stand for. But for this pre-smoker or non-smoker, Reynolds said the things that keep that confirmed smoker habituated and satisfied are unknown or largely unexplained to the non-smoker. So only after experiencing smoking for some period of time do the physiological satisfactions and habituation become apparent and needed. And the industry then must somehow convince this pre-smoker or non-smoker with wholly irrational reasons to try smoking in the hope that they will discover the real satisfactions obtained. No euphemisms here from British American Tobacco in 1980. BAT should learn to look at itself as a drug company rather than as a tobacco company. Now, what did the industry know about the relationship between nicotine and cigarette design? And these are from the Philip Morris document collections. So in the 1950s, they'd already figured out that that cigarette smoke was largely comprised of smoke particles that were 1 micron in diameter. And they'd already figured out that diameter was near optimum to retain smoke in the lungs. And again, 1950s, they'd already figured out the public health dilemma from that. They said, well, that 1 micron particle size is undesirable because the retention of tar particles, euphemism for cancer and everything else, retention of the bad stuff is high, but it's desirable because it's maximally retentive of the physiologically active components. And there was an imperative to preserve the physiological response because Philip Morris was doing some research into, well, could we alter particle size of smoke particles? And so the conclusion here was if the size of the smoke particles were to be changed, alternative means might be required to increase the alkaloid content in the smoke. I think that this review of nicotine and the relationship between nicotine and cigarette design is important because of what it reveals about the true nature of the business that the industry was in. They were in the drug delivery business. And time doesn't permit me to go into any detail on other aspects of cigarette design, but understand the nicotine content in cigarettes does not happen by accident, happenstance. It is not an art. It is an exquisite science. So we talk about the cigarette being purposely designed to create and sustain addiction because the industry has chosen what the nicotine levels should be, which was why Ken's reference to modeling that went back and said, well, what if the nicotine content had been different 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago? It's very relevant to today because the industry has the ability to set the nicotine levels wherever they want through things like the blending of tobacco leaves, chemical manipulation of the tobacco smoke. But as you've heard those of us in the field say for decades, they have purposely designed their product to both create and sustain addiction. So with that as a framing to keep in mind, now let's take a look at the relevant provisions of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act when it comes to what we call this product standard thing for very low nicotine cigarette and other combustible products. And the key section of the statute is section 907, and section 907A3 makes clear that the secretary, and anytime you see the word secretary in a statute like this, you can think FDA because all of these authorities get delegated down from the Secretary of Health and Human Services to an agency like FDA. But section 907 of the act makes clear that that the agency can enact product standards if they are appropriate for the protection of the public health. And the statute has mandatory considerations that FDA has to be thinking about, entertaining, and looking at evidence for when it comes to moving forward with the product standard. And that includes taking a look at risks and benefits to the population as a whole, including users and non-users, and then the increased or decreased likelihood that current users would stop or that new users would start. And so if you go back now to the 2 most recent product standards that FDA has proposed, you will see how the agency applies that sort of statutory framework to the evidence that they had at hand. There is no question that FDA has the authority to take the product standard provision and apply it to nicotine levels. Congress was explicit in subsection A4 of 907 that if the agency was going to move forward with a product standard, that it can include provisions appropriate for the protection of public health where appropriate, and this is straight out of the statute, for nicotine yields of the product. But it came with a limitation. Congress, I think, understood the magnitude of such a product standard, that is a game-changing application of this authority to cigarettes. And so Congress said, FDA, you can do it, but you can't take it down to 0, that is prohibited. So whenever FDA comes out with a proposed product standard for nicotine reduction, it will be at a level above 0. The law is clear that FDA cannot take nicotine yields down to 0. So that's the statutory framework. But as I said in my introduction, it's also important for you all to understand the process, which you heard Brian describe in his talk, And the process of making this happen is called notice and comment rulemaking. Any kind of product standard is then subject to the requirements of a sister statute that's known as the Administrative Procedure Act. An FDA goes about making policy here through what we call notice and comment rulemaking. And here are the phases of the rulemaking. It starts with drafting and clearing a proposed rule and then publishing it. And as an aside, and in thinking about Ken and Brian's presentations, let me tell you one other great value of computational modeling that I think is unique to computational modeling. And I can tell you that it helped me as center director when I was trying to persuade the Biden administration in its first year to say yes to menthol and yes to cigar flavors. The results of dynamic population level modeling then becomes a really important tool in explaining to decision makers, here are the projected population level public health impacts if you say yes to this. And there's very little science that can be as dramatic as the results that you saw earlier on what would happen with the nicotine product standard. So that's only possible through modeling. I can tell you, as a consumer of modeling, when I was in government, it became a very important tool in seeking support to move forward with what starts with the proposed rule. So the next stage is then the comment period, which is typically for 60 or 90 days. And then after the public comment period, FDA will go very quiet because then under the terms of the Administrative Procedure Act, they have to spend the time that's needed to review all the comments. You heard Brian say the proposed menthol product standard got 250,000 comments. Now, many comments are parts of letter writing campaigns, but for any given proposed rule, there could be hundreds or thousands of very substantive, meaty comments, and the agency legally must go through and read and carefully consider all of the information in all of the comments. When they've completed that part of the process, they then look back at the proposed rule and make a decision. Are we going to go forward with a final rule or not? And if they make the decision to go forward with the final rule, then they have to draft and clear the final rule and publish it. Only this time, the final rule will come with what is known as an effective date. The effective date is the date by which that final rule will go into effect. That becomes very important for reasons that I'll explain in just a second legally, because once a final rule is in effect, industry has to comply, and there are civil and possibly even criminal penalties for failure to comply with the final rule of the order that we're talking about here. But the legal burden, the evidentiary burden, is on the agency when it comes to putting any product standard forward. And in what we call the preamble, or the narrative part of any proposed or final rule, that's where FDA makes its evidentiary case. That's where all of your science comes into play, because it's the preamble where all of the scientific evidence is laid out, whether it's on the science of nicotine addiction, the results of modeling, the results of any nicotine reduction studies, everything else. It's all laid out there as the evidentiary support for a proposed and final product standard. But very importantly, then, at the final rule stage, and again, to fulfill the legal obligations that the agency has under the Administrative Procedure Act, the preamble is where the agency must respond to many of the substantive comments that were submitted during the public comment period. And that's where the agency gets to say they agree or disagree with the commenter and why. And in the preamble, if the agency chooses to make any changes to the proposed rule based upon any of the new information that's put on the administrative record during the comment period, that's where you would see the agency explain why it looked back at the proposed rule and made any changes that it did as a result of new information that came in. Which leads us to the last phase of the process and this notion of what is considered under the Administrative Procedure Act, final agency action, which can then open the door for lawsuits. Litigation challenging a rulemaking ordinarily can only be brought after an agency takes final agency action. A proposed rule, by definition, it's only a proposed, and I explained that there's a period while FDA is reviewing the comments where it could make a decision not to go forward with the. So in general, litigation cannot be brought at the proposed rule stage of the process. But publication of a final rule is considered final agency action. And at that point, litigation can be brought. And for this type of rulemaking, any industry lawsuit against a final nicotine product standard would start in a federal district court of the plaintiff's choosing. And we would expect that in such a case, the industry would also ask for what's known as a stay to prevent that effective date from going into effect until all of the litigation is over. Now, there are several levels of judicial review that are possible. Any losing party at the district court has the absolute right to take a case to the circuit court, and whoever then loses in the circuit court can try to get the Supreme Court to hear the case. The Supreme Court would only hear a case like this in its discretion, though I would guess that this is the kind of case that the Supreme Court might be interested in hearing up on appeal from a circuit court. So depending upon how many rounds of litigation, you can add 1 to 3 years following publication of the final rule before anything would ever go into effect. And that's assuming that the stay had been issued. And we have no idea how much time in any final rule FDA would be prepared to give the industry before they had to be in compliance with a nicotine product standard. So I hope, starting with the historic industry insights, the framing of the statute and the process, that you have a better understanding as we now take a deeper dive with Neil and Dorothy into the science of nicotine addiction and the science of nicotine reduction. And thank you very much for your time.